Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the bizval webinar. It's been a while since our last webinar, so it's really great to be here today. Almost middle of February, a day before Valentine's Day. So those of you who haven't yet bought flowers and cards and what have you for your loved ones, still got a few hours left to get that done. I think today, unfortunately, Doug Pudney's not able to join us, so I've had to draft in Stephen, who's making his webinar debut today. So Stephen, thanks for joining us. And today we're going to be talking a little bit about tools for growing an advisory practice. So before we dive into that, just some housekeeping and a couple of check-ins. First and foremost, please feel free to add any questions in the chat or the Q&A. We'll have a section for Q&A at the end, and we'd love to kind of just engage you guys. And if there's anything that comes up during the webinar that you want to share with others, pop it in the chat, and we'll get to it either as we go going through or at the end of the webinar. There's also a poll running, so if you get a chance, please go and just complete the poll question. And yeah, we're really excited to be here today. So I think just in terms of today's agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about the webinar objectives. We're going to then talk about the sort of three areas of tools: diagnostic and strategic tools. We're going to talk a bit about client engagement and business development techniques, and then some community building and thought leadership techniques as well. And then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways. And obviously, the word advisory is quite a broad term. It can be anything from growth advisory through to marketing, through to fractional CFOs. So we've tried to keep the content reasonably generic. Obviously, as bizval, there's going to be a bias towards some of the tools and some of the things that we use. But also we want to kind of share some of the stories with a lot of the advisors and the partners that we work with, and what's effective with them, and some of the stories, and maybe one or two case studies as we go along. I'm not going to introduce myself again. I'm just looking at the names here, and a lot of them look really familiar. So I assume most of you know who I am, but I'm the founder and CEO of bizval, and yeah, excited to be here. And I'm going to let Stephen just introduce himself quickly. I think some of you might have met him already, but as I said, it's his webinar debut, so he's being thrown into the deep end today. So Steve, wouldn't you just say hi and just give everyone a little bit of a background about yourself?
Oh, thanks, Graham. And I definitely recognize a few attendees as well. So I'm guessing a good few know me and potentially a client or two. But I sit on the valuation side. So for many client engagements with bizval, I'd be one of the individuals assisting with the valuation process, and also sitting in the back end and making sure our systems and processes work for our partners. So that's where I come in on the bizval side.
Thanks, Steve, and look forward to hearing your insights today. So I think just to quickly recap on the objectives of the webinar. So, we're going to take probably about 20, 25 minutes talking through some tools and techniques, and then we're going to open the floor up for questions. But I think the sort of three top objectives for today is, one is, I guess, highlighting the role of an advisor. So, one of the things about an advisor, whether you're a fractional CFO or a strategic advisor, is about helping the client or the business owner to see the bigger picture. Often business owners are caught in the day-to-day operations, they're fighting fires, and in fact, it's a big challenge with businesses in terms of being sale ready or exit ready, in that owners are so entrenched in the business. So one of the key roles of the advisor is to help them see the bigger picture. It's not about giving them laundry lists of things to do in a business. And I think it's an important point, is around what are the key drivers and the strategic inputs that you as an advisor can give to your clients that can move their business forward. So less is more in this case. So that's objective number one, is to kind of highlight the role of the advisor. We're also going to cover some of the essential tools and techniques to help you grow an advisory practice. So as I said earlier, whether you're a fractional CFO, growth advisor, exit readiness expert, an M&A advisor, I think some of these things are transferable and hopefully relevant. And what can you expect from today? Hopefully some actionable insights. There is going to be a bit of a bias towards some of the business valuation and readiness scorecards. We're going to talk a bit about scenario planning and some client engagement strategies as well. So I very quickly just want to share, before we get into the meat of it, a quick success story. It's a very short case study, but this is an example of where one of our fractional CFO partners actually worked with a client not too long ago. And effectively, this business was in survival mode. There are a couple of things that happened in the business. They lost a key client. There was some owner dependency, lots of customer concentration risk. And over 3 years, I say bizval, but the fractional CFO actually helped them make some key improvements. And in the space of 3 years, they 5x'd their revenue and they 10x'd their valuation in that period. And essentially, there were three key things that they did to achieve this. The first one was operational efficiency. So they streamlined some processes and used automation. The second is they shifted towards a recurring revenue model. So in this business, they moved to long-term contracts and they managed to reduce some of the client dependency that they had previously. And very simply, they created some strategic alignment. So they, by using valuation as a tool, were able to kind of align the financial goals, their exit objectives, and then the key, 2 or 3 things that they needed to do operationally to be able to execute on that. So I'm not going to dwell on this case study. Krishenda's put a link in the chat. So if you want to go read this, it is on our website. The link is in the chat. Download that and read it a little bit later. So without further ado, and you're going to get sick of hearing my voice, I'm going to hand over to Steve, and Steve is going to talk a little bit about the importance of diagnostic and strategic tools, and how these can be used in an advisory practice to kind of set the scene with the client.
Okay, thanks, Graham. And valuations are such a useful tool, but I think one of the biggest issues we see, and I think it's also the same with partners or any advisors using valuations, is trying to help a business owner understand why it matters. In so many instances, evaluation is a reactionary process. There's a dispute happening in the business and shares have to change hands. Potentially someone's just coming up to retirement age and needs to now conduct a valuation and see what their business is worth. But there's some sort of cause that requires the valuation to happen. And that's exactly what we're trying to break. There needs to be a proactive valuation process, and that's something that can be driven by yourselves as partners. It's a case of explaining to a business owner why understanding their value matters and translating it to them in a way they can understand. So that's where, in terms of our valuation process, it's a lot more simplified. It's not 100 pages of Excel. It's something that business owners can really take to heart, and more importantly, that they can use to understand where their value lies. So it's a proactive process. It's the single KPI, as I like to think of it, that you should be using with your clients. Do evaluation once a year. It can be a single diagnostic to then evaluate how they proceed over the next 12 months. And when they get to that point, you have a baseline to work against. So one case in point I can think of is a client we had a while back, and it was a young business. They'd been around for 2 years. And they came to us for a more in-depth valuation engagement, but just purely for the reason that they didn't understand valuation. They wanted some hand-holding through the process. They wanted to know what they were worth, which wasn't a huge amount at that stage, but they wanted to know how to grow it and what tools they had to put into place, what levers they could pull to create that value. So once they'd understood where they are now, they could start putting those plans into place to reach their valuation in 5 years' time and 10 years' time. So that's very much.
I think if I jump in there, Stephen, it's a little bit like, it's one of those things which is like important but not urgent. And a valuation tool is not actually about the valuation, but it's about what are the 2 or 3 key levers that you can pull to make that better. It's a little bit about like your health, right? You can go to the doctor and you can check your blood pressure, you can check all of those things and say, well, your biological age is older or younger than your actual age. But then it's what do you do with that? Do you change your diet? Do you exercise more? And I guess evaluation, in our view, is a very similar tool, but looking at the business rather than your health.
Precisely. It's not what the value is, it's why it's that level, what's created that value. So you'll see we've got a couple of stats up in front, and this is just pulled from our back-end data. But there's obviously a number of assumptions and inputs that go into creating that value. But you can see on the left graph, it's a very clear step up, and that's just a degree of owner dependency. So all the way on the left, we can see the average value of businesses that have come through us is around $160,000 if we normalize it to USD. And that's with a critically high level of owner dependence. Naturally, those businesses are worth less. And that's not including the fact that those probably have lower revenue outside of greater risk assumptions. And then you can see the clear steps as we move to the right. As soon as we go to high owner dependence, but not quite as critical, we jump to 880, give or take. That then increases to 1.7 and up to 2 million on an average basis for a business where the owner's not at all reliant. It can operate completely without them, and they're just there for strategic input. So that's just one input. But the nice thing is, you'll see when we get to the next section, we can actually see what difference that makes to the valuation upfront, and that's a really useful tool. That being said, value isn't everything, and that's what we've got in front of us now. So valuation is numbers driven. There's a lot of assumptions. There's some qualitative input, but just because a business is worth X doesn't necessarily mean it will sell. And that's where on our side, we've developed an exit scorecard or investment scorecard. And its purpose is very much to try and identify what the risks in a business are that might lead to an investment failing, or when a business is going through due diligence for the acquirer to see something that puts them off and pull out of a deal. So what we've done is build this out into a 12-step and then also an 80-step process. Sorry, Graham.
Just for a second, I just see a couple of people are commenting they can't see any slides. So, yeah, if you guys can just comment if it's only one person, or if you people can't see the slides, please just put something in the chat or in the Q&A.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, hopefully you can see the slides, but this is now the other side to valuations. It's the completely quantitative element to try and identify what the other value drivers in a business are, but more importantly, what are the detractors. So it might be a little bit small, but please reach out afterwards if you'd like any more information on the different categories. But we'll look into areas like the depth of management, the level of risk monitoring, current legal status in the business, the level of financial compliance, and a myriad of other factors. And these are all elements that when a business is going through due diligence or an investor's analyzing it, that they will investigate. And it's in our experience that a lot of business owners are very much driven by operating the day-to-day. And some of these things get left to the side to be done later, which is all fine and well. But when it becomes too late, then it's an issue. So what we're trying to do is combine the valuation aspect and the education around knowing what your business is worth, along with the qualitative elements of having those systems and processes in place, and even just the repositories, so that when the time comes, your business is ready. It's always the case of you don't have to be selling your business, but you should always be ready. When someone comes knocking, you want to have everything in place to get the best offer possible. And the alternative
I think, Steve, if I can
have a better business.
If I can jump in there, sorry, there's a little bit of a delay on my side, is,
Sure.
I think as an advisor, we have this sort of mantra that you need to tell the client what they need to hear, not what they want to hear. So the benefit of using tools like these sort of diagnostic tools, and there are many, there's things, I probably shouldn't mention competitor names, but there's different ones with different styles, is it actually enables you to objectively share with your client, what the sort of pitfalls are in their business. So it takes all the emotion out of it, and it highlights quite quickly what the sort of 2 or 3 key factors are that you need to focus on. So that's why we're a big fan of advisors actually using tools, and then actually having the support from those tool providers to actually give them insight, the data that underpins that. You can start to benchmark against other clients. And we'll talk a little bit later about that importance of creating an advisor community and the sharing of that data. But I think, Steve, maybe we can move on to the last one, and that's, I guess, just the importance of scenario planning. So for those of you who have read, scenario planning is a well-known concept. But for the South Africans in the room, Clem Sunter, famous, Mind of the Fox, and the different scenario planning tools. But Steve, let's just talk about why we believe this is such an important tool for advisors.
Exactly. This follows on from our midpoint valuation. And it's always the case where a business owner gets to a value, but they might want more, or they just want to understand why it's at that level. And that's where the sensitivity comes in. You have to run the different scenarios. You have to understand what happens if we look at a lower growth rate. How will that affect our valuation? what happens if potentially we can pass a 10% increase in our pricing? How will that affect our current valuation? And that's where this becomes an incredibly powerful tool. And as you'll see over here, there's a bunch of different graphs, but it's all interactive. So it's something you can actually sit with your client and discuss and run different tests. If they're curious, what would happen if I employed a new marketing person? They're going to cost an extra, maybe $30,000 a year or something like that, but potentially they can add X amount of revenue. And you can sit and run those examples, and the result might be higher or lower than your midpoint, but you have actionable insight. You can come up with ideas, you can run the tests and see exactly how that affects the current valuation. So it's incredibly useful as a planning tool, but it's also then useful for monitoring purposes. It's a case of running scenarios, but also tracking a business over time. If you notice your revenue is trending in one direction, profits trending down, you can start making those little tweaks one way or the other just to see where your valuation is tracking. And it doesn't have to be a yearly exercise. It could be a case of doing a base valuation once a year. But as the months go by or the business owner has an idea, you can run the test or just do a quarterly check on where the valuation is trending. So that's where the measurement side is so important, to actively track the value of a business over time and know that the decisions the business owner is making are for the right reasons.
I think I can jump in there.
See the value.
Yeah. We're making a habit of talking over each other here, but I think for the finance professionals in the room, scenario analysis is a well-known concept with budgets and high road, low road, medium road. But our experience with advisors is, without sounding arrogant, you kind of need to dumb it down often for the business owner. So you don't have too many scenarios. You have some practical scenarios that you can actually if I do the following, what happens? And the power of this is it actually visualizes for the business owner what that outcome can be. As opposed to kind of having 300 cells that you can change multiple things. Scenario planning is about the simplicity of it and having practical and easily viable strategies and seeing what that means, not just from a current year profit perspective, but for long-term growth in terms of the business. Cool. So I'm going to move on a little bit. So we've spoken a little bit about some of the tools that at bizval we've seen our partners use effectively and help that to transform businesses. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other things as an advisory business. Everyone's looking for new clients. So whether you're a fractional CFO, one of the biggest things is how do you grow your business? So client engagement and business development techniques. And we've seen sort of 3 techniques which have been fairly successful. I think the one thing we need to recognize in the advisory world is it's not a dog-eat-dog competitor world. It's actually about creating collaboration. There's more than enough clients to go around. It's a question of you as an advisor finding the right fit and finding the right clients for you. And I think there's sort of 3 things that we've seen. One is what we call lead hooks, okay? And lead hooks are ways to attract clients. The second, we see it used quite extensively, is your annual business health check. So it's leading on a little bit from what Stephen was talking about just now. One of those could be a valuation tool. And then the third one is actually structuring value add conversations or workshops with your clients. So this is around how do you deepen the conversation when you engage with your client. So the first thing with lead hooks is a bunch of different ways of doing this. A lead hook is in essence giving out a little bit of free information to find prospective clients. So it could be a free tool that you have on your website. It could be a questionnaire. It could be a scorecard. We use a platform called Score App to help build some of our scorecards. It's a great way when somebody's browsing on the internet to actually answer a few questions and kind of match them as a client. So, the really good advisors are using these things, not as spam bots, but really as a way to kind of filter the right kind of prospective clients for them. So lead hooks are a great way to filter which are real prospective clients and those that are just browsing on the internet. Okay. The second is, I guess, our annual business health check. As an advisory business, whether you're a legal advisor or what have you, take a step back. And this business health check is like going to your physician or your doctor for a checkup every year. I'm a male of a certain age, and I have to go for an annual checkup, which is not always pleasant, but it's something that you have to do, because even when things are going well, you want to go and see that there's just nothing sinister hiding in the background. Okay, and if you wait until something goes wrong, it's too late. So this annual business health check is something as an advisor. We had a client session this morning where we basically went through this process with them, and the owner said to me, he said, like, I'm so entrenched in the business. It's not often that I take an hour and a half out where I actually start thinking about working on the business. What is the health of my business? So I think as an advisor, this is a really, really important thing to do, is to build that into your process. Don't just think of it as I do a job and then I move on, or I've got the retainer client and this doesn't matter anymore. It's critical to make sure that you take that step back and engage your clients and keep them engaged. And then the third one to talk about a little bit is structuring, I guess, what we call a value add conversation or workshop with the client. So as much as using tools and lead hooks and all these things is useful, at the end of the day, you actually need to go deep with the client. You need to go and really understand their business and understand what are the things that they're struggling with. So I'm going to talk about a few things. What are the things you can do to actually plan and execute a workshop that uncovers the client's pain points and identifies opportunities? And you'll see under the tips there, the first one is to actually let the client do the talking. So one of the things that our successful advisors do is they ask kind of leading questions to help the client identify what's actually going on in their business. Most founders, owners, business people are more knowledgeable about their business than anybody else. And sometimes they just need a question to unlock the solution that's sitting in their mind. I know coaches will tell you this all the time. They're just there to ask questions. And there's quite a lot of truth in that, is to ask the right questions. The other thing is to start with the vision. And again, I don't want to kind of sound like motherhood and apple pie, but it's useful to check in with the founder. Like, what is your vision? Is it still the same? Has it changed? And that you do not sort of every single session, but it is important. Organizations and businesses drift. So as an advisor, you also want to make sure that you are aligned to what your client is trying to achieve. And it's useful to kind of bring the two of you together. But again, it reminds the business owner of why he's there. We also talk about this value add conversation workshop again. It's about not adding too much information. So we talk about this rule of 3. What are the 3 things that you want to talk about with the client? Once you start going more than 3, maybe you can argue 5 things, it becomes information overload for a busy business owner or client. So as an advisor, it's actually really important to say, what are we not going to talk about? And I'll use this example. Even when you put webinars together, sometimes it's really difficult. You think like 45 minutes that I want to fill out, but you actually have to think, what are the 3 things that I really want to focus on? Okay, we've cheated a little bit on this webinar because we've got 3 sections. Each section has got 3 different things. So okay, that's technically 9 things. But I think breaking things up into small components is a super useful tool in terms of some of these workshops. And then some of the questions that are really helpful is, what are your pain points? What's keeping you awake at night? Who's your best customer and why? Who's your worst customer and why? So we just kind of wanted to highlight the importance of having a value add conversation. And from that, a lot of the sort of pain points will emerge. And that then, together with the tools, your valuations, your scorecards, allows you as an advisor to then paint a picture or path for your client to optimize their value or achieve whatever goal they set out to achieve. Steve, I don't know if you want to add anything else in here before I move on to the last section.
No, not at all. I think you've covered it really nicely there. But it's also just touching back to things like the live valuation and the exit scorecard. It's using tools that can aid you in this process. And that's why I just want to jump in on that exit process. You've heard me say it 100 times, but that exit scorecard is so great just as a narrative. it's not necessarily what's said in the tool, but it's the conversation that happens around it. But having that guided process of going from start to finish, having to discuss marketing aspects with the business owner that doesn't care about it, brings out all sorts of different aspects that you wouldn't have spoken about otherwise. So that's also where sometimes being very tailored and focused can also be the wrong approach. It's a case of keeping it wide and discussing various aspects and seeing what pops up. And you can then focus on what really matters and try and find those additional elements that might unlock some additional value or just be useful to your clients.
Absolutely. Let's wrap up with two more things. And I think as an advisory practice, it can often be quite lonely. I mean, we're not talking about, the big consulting firms, with 2,000 employees, but most advisory practices are fairly small teams. And something we've seen, be really effective is about how do you build a community? How do you build a community of fellow advisors? So most advisors tend to niche in on one or two particular things. You might be a growth advisor, might be a marketing expert, you might be a legal advisor or compliance advisor. And I think what's really, really important is to realize that there's collaboration rather than sort of pure take out the opposition. You might even be collaborating. You might be a fractional CFO, but who's got a specialization in fundraising, as opposed to FP&A, like forecasting and planning. So it's really super important as an advisor to build a community that fosters both ongoing client relationships, but also referrals within your network and your advisor network. So this is something we've seen as being super important across the world. And successful advisors recognize this. They recognize that they're not an island and they don't necessarily need to be better than the next guy. It's not about outdoing the next guy. It's about understanding where can somebody else actually serve you better. And we often have that in our practice. We work with other valuation businesses where something is out of scope for us. We refer that on, so and that creates a really nice environment where there's a degree of collaboration, but also recognizing where you're out of your depth and potentially risk offering advice where you're not actually competent. So the sort of the Dunning-Kruger effect. You try to avoid that. I think the other thing here is how do you actually structure a masterclass or a networking event? And again, this comes down to asking a question, perhaps. Getting a topical theme, having a case study. These are all good things that bring people together to start to build a community. So you've got to create something, a topic that has got a lot of interest, so it's common for everybody, and then invite participants to come and share their experiences and share their stories. So community-based masterclasses, networking events. The last thing I would add there is that, for a period after COVID, everybody went online. I mean, even this webinar is an online webinar. But, in-person networking events are definitely seeing a revival over here. Doesn't have to be all the bells and whistles and drinks and canapes and all of that sort of thing, but actually just inviting people to come together without too much of an agenda and just good old-fashioned networking is definitely making a comeback. And in the advisory space, I think it's super important that you consider these things. You don't just hold yourself up in your little corner and plug away. And then the last one is about white papers and opinion piece articles. How do you demonstrate to your prospective clients and to your audience that you're actually competent at what you do? So it's really important to think about some sort of content strategy. It doesn't mean you need to be an SEO expert. It doesn't mean you need to be a publisher. But nowadays, anybody can go and write an opinion piece or a white paper, or even record a video and place it on LinkedIn. So it's really important to establish your credibility. Why are you good at what you do? Case studies, and establish yourself as an authority in your advisory niche. As I mentioned earlier, it's all very well having this content, but how do you get it out there? So things like newsletters, definitely they go through cycles, but having a mailing list that you regularly reach out and contact your network and your prospective clients. LinkedIn is a great platform, as we all know, to just kind of extend your reach, especially if you're growing a global practice. It allows you to reach, customers in different geographies, different continents for that matter. As I said, from a bizval perspective, we've got clients in 6 continents. So it's really opened up that opportunity. And I think as an advisor, you can't just be thinking about your little corner of the world. You've got to be thinking broader than that. And I think the last thing is just around, getting your whole team involved. If you're an advisory business, everyone from your assistant, even to the person who doesn't like getting Stephen involved in a webinar is an example of that. He prefers to be one-on-one with the client. So I know I'm putting him out of his comfort zone, but I think when it comes to distribution of opinion pieces and articles, use your network to share those things. Use WhatsApp, for argument's sake, and create content which is different and not just noisy. So yeah, I've done a lot of talking today, everyone, and that's really the sort of wrap of the sort of formal part of the webinar. So to recap, in terms of the three things that we focused on today: advisory tools, diagnostic tools. Think about what those diagnostic tools are for your practice. In our niche, that's around business valuation, investment readiness scorecards, and some scenario planning. If you're in the legal space, it might be somewhat different. Risk tools. If you're in the HR advisory space, it might be things like disc profiles and strengths finder. But think about what diagnostic tools you want to use in your business. Think about your engagement techniques. So what are you doing to attract customers, lead hooks, health checks, structured value add workshops? And finally, think about how you build community and create thought leadership within that community, whether it's masterclasses, networking events, content marketing, white papers, and articles. So Steve, I'll leave it to you if there's any sort of closing words from your side, but else we'll open the floor to any questions if there are any. Steve, some closing thoughts?
Yeah, so just in closing, I think there's a lot of very good suggestions all through this webinar, but also just try different things. Have a go at implementing a scorecard on the website or creating a piece of thought leadership. Write that white paper. Just start releasing content, put it out there and see what works. It's always the best place to start with something and then follow what's actually achieving results. So I think the big point is also just to get started.
Fantastic. Well, I don't see any questions coming through, but we'll give it another 20 seconds or so if anybody's got anything they want to pop into the chat. But if not, please feel free to reach out to us via email. You've got our details. We want to thank everybody who's joined us for taking the time to be here today. And yeah, our next webinar is probably going to be towards the end of March. If anybody's got any suggestions, topics they want us to cover, please pop it through to us on any of our channels or via email. But if there's nothing coming through and it doesn't look like there's any questions, thanks for joining us and have a wonderful rest of the day.